The US film industry migrates to Southern California in the mid-teens. And then we have ethnic Mexicans migrating during the revolution and afterwards. They were like, working in Hollywood seems really cool. Let's do it. But often what they ended up doing were playing extras in Westerns, in those same films that are promoting stereotypes.
From the Autry Museum, located on Tongva Homelands in Los Angeles, California, join us in asking, what is a Western? I'm really thrilled to have with us today Laura Isabel Serna, who is an associate professor of history and cinema and media studies at University of Southern California here in Los Angeles. And she's the author of Making Cinelandia, American Films and Mexican Film Culture, which came out a few years ago, as well as a number of articles and chapters about film history. So we're really excited to talk about the history of Westerns as they kind of connected with Mexican and potentially other Latin American film audiences. So thank you for joining us, Laura.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, thanks. So can you just tell us, just to sort of set the context of the kind of time that you have mostly written about, of where film culture was in Mexico and how it connected to American cinema in your book and in some of your other writings?
Sure. So in the late teens, as probably most of your viewers will know, there's this huge civil conflict in Mexico, the Mexican Revolution, and it lasts for almost a decade. The military phase of it does. And film had already been introduced, French film, in the late 19th century, and had become quite popular, especially in urban areas, but also in more rural areas. There were itinerant exhibitors who went out and showed films that were imported, and there was some domestic production. But in the late teens, there was this sort of confluence of factors that led to American films becoming more dominant in the Mexican marketplace. And those factors were the end of the Mexican Revolution, which, it made it a little bit easier. Even though films were being screened during the revolution, there are accounts of soldiers, many of whom were from rural areas, coming to cities and like going to the movie theater for the first time during the revolution. But there's also World War I, which is this huge watershed in global film history, because it allows the United States to enter markets that had previously been dominated by European cinema. And so in Mexico, around 1917, 1918, US film studios begin to see an opportunity. And they open offices, they establish relationships with distributors, and more American films are shown, and they become really popular. And there's a debate that happens where some people are like, American films are awful and they're sensationalistic, because some of the first films that became really popular were serial films, which are full of cliffhangers and action and violence, et cetera. And many people were like, these are not really the kinds of films people need to see. And among those films were Westerns. And so you had kind of posed the question to me in correspondence, like, did they show Westerns? And it was a question I was like, wow, I hadn't really thought about the question quite that way. And I went and looked just in the digitized it's the National Hemeroteca, so it's where they store newspapers and magazines. And I just did a search for Tom Mix, right? Super popular Western star, and he's everywhere. And people are watching those films as well as melodramas, as well as kind of mysteries and thrillers, et cetera, detective films. And it's kind of a piece with American films that are considered high quality and thrilling, right? I think that's the most important aspect of the Western, right? That it has this high drama that kind of appealed to the substantial audience for films in Mexico. And there was a substantial audience for films in Mexico. Many people think, well, Mexicans didn't see films until they came to the United States, but that's only true for a very small part of the population. There were theaters in every major city. There were theaters in every minor city. There were mobile theaters. There were guys who, during the week, they would use their electric generator to grind corn for their town. And on Saturdays and Sundays, they would hook it up to a projector and it would become the town movie theater.
That's great. It's important to remember how films are so embedded in in life. And that's a perfect, the generator is a great image for that, I think. Have you come across any record of sort of how people responded to Westerns in particular? Because so much the landscape would be somewhat familiar or similar to a lot of Mexican landscapes. Cowboys obviously adopting a lot of vaquero
Mhm.
sort of attire and sort of tropes. I wonder if there's any kind of record of how those films in particular were taken. Did it seem more familiar than a detective film or a melodrama of some sort?
Well, so I can't say that I have strong evidence that that was more familiar per se, but and I think that we think about vaqueros and the charro as these Mexican symbols, but at this moment they're really still symbols of a particular region in Mexico, the north, and a particular kind of culture. And so, what I have come across, what I will say, is that just like sensational serial films, the upper middle class, the intelligentsia, the people who are having debates about culture, think that Westerns are just as lowbrow as these other kinds of films. And mostly because they're focused on action. There's shootouts, etc. And so they're like, this is not what people should be watching Shakespeare on film. It's a very familiar conversation. What I will say is that Mexicans were deeply attuned to the ways that American Westerns depicted Mexico and Mexicans in stereotypical ways. They were, really kind of careful viewers. Some of that depended on context. I'm sure just like today, there are people who just went to see films and were like, I love it. I love Tom Mix. He's my favorite hero.
Mhm.
Or I love William Hart. Like, he's amazing. And then there were other people, particularly in my research, I found people who lived in border regions, consuls, so the diplomatic corps that's abroad, that are really concerned with the ways that Mexicans and Mexico, or the border more generally, are being used to show Mexico in a kind of derogatory manner. So much so that in 1923, there's a boycott of American films by the Mexican government. And this is really kind of on the level of PR. I think it's a little bit harder. There's a film, and I can't remember who the director was, but it's from 1993 called Mi Querido Tom Mix. And it's basically about, have you seen it?
No, I
No,
need
it's
to.
really kind of amazing. It's about this woman who lives in a little town in northern Mexico, and she loves to go to the movie theater and watch Tom Mix Westerns. And then there's a man who enters the story, and she thinks that he's Tom Mix, and she has this kind of romantic um, encounter with him. And so it's really kind of a meditation on spectatorship, on the Western, and on kind of Mexican spectators, but it doesn't pose a problem for her, like that might be a kind of set of stereotypes that she's watching. She just considers it as like kind of a foreign, exotic locale that she's entering into imaginatively. There's a film it's in the National Film Registry called La Venganza de Pancho Villa. That's a compilation film. It's a biopic, I guess you could say that, that this man made, who was a film exhibitor in El Paso, an itinerant exhibitor. He was an ethnic Mexican. He had businesses on both sides of the border. He owned a movie theater for a while, and he took films that had Villa-like characters and cut them up and made his own sort of story about Villa. He shot a very limited amount of footage and used some still photographs and some newsreel footage, and kind of flip the narrative to make Villa a hero out of these denigrating, I guess, or stereotypical images of Villa that have been circulated. It's really a fascinating film. It's amazing.
Wow, what year is that from?
He made this film in the 30s. We don't have an exact year. He kept working on it. He was doing it with his son, and he kept kind of changing it, and he would exhibit it. So his family had some material, historical material, that included posters and accounts of where he had shown it, how much money he had made. So he would show it with his other films. He would take it in his truck and with his projector, and he would show it around kind of southern Texas and northern Mexico along the border. He made okay money on it. The films, a lot of them are from the teens, the films that he's using. It's remarkable, actually. And to me, as a scholar, it's really one of the only kind of material examples of Mexican spectatorship that we have, because he's actually like looking at these films, thinking about them, and reframing them from his own perspective.
That is amazing.
Yeah,
I think we have to screen that someday.
it's been restored by
Yeah.
the Library of Congress. It's beautiful the way it's been restored, and it's also like just a fascinating historical object
Yeah.
about the border that tells us a lot about both how the revolution was thought of on both sides, and also how Mexican audiences kind of received films in which Mexicans were the villains.
Wow.
Yeah.
That
So,
is,
so Villa's played by like 3 different people in the
that's
film.
great.
Yeah, kind of amazing.
People are aware of how Mexicans or Mexican Americans were being portrayed in these films.
Some people, when the Mexican government issues this boycott, US film studios are nervous, but they're not so nervous about Mexico. Mexico's not their biggest Latin American market. They're really concerned about Argentina and Brazil. But they recognize Mexico as being this kind of leader in the region. And so they think, oh, if Mexico boycotts our products, then all these other countries are going to boycott our products as well. And it's not even clear that these films that people found objectionable were circulating in Mexico, because a lot of the denunciations come from consuls in Chicago or in San Diego or in other parts of the world, even where US films are being exhibited. But what is clear is that they want the United States to change its representational practices. But at the same time, I found this beautiful letter in the archive from people who worked in a cinema, who were the people who took tickets, who were the projectionists, and they were like, these films are fine. There's nothing wrong with them. And mostly because their livelihoods depended on showing films. So I think that we probably have a situation where some people are hypersensitive or hyper aware, maybe is a better way to put it. And then some people just see it as part of everyday life. And maybe you like Westerns, maybe you don't. Maybe you prefer to see other kinds of films, but they're available. There definitely is evidence that people who lived in the United States were deeply aware, and I think this is an argument I make in the book, that because those stereotypes affected their day-to-day lives, right? Because they're interacting with Anglos in Texas, for example, or in San Diego, that they were more attuned to the way that those stereotypes had echoed in social life.
I keep thinking about like the bad hombre kind of type of image that kind of already in the silent era, I think is there, right? That continues to.
Yeah, well established. People wrote letters. They wrote letters to the editor of Spanish language newspapers. And they're like, this gives our neighbors a really poor impression of who Mexicans are. When they really saw how mass media representations really fed prejudice and discrimination. You know, some of these letters were addressed to the president of Mexico. They would be sent to the consulates, et cetera. Can you help us kind of by asking them to stop making these kinds of films or stop circulating them? In response to the boycott of films, some filmmakers did respond. Now, their responses were kind of funny, right? So Harold Lloyd makes this film called Why Worry? And I've actually written about it a couple times, but it's a comedy. His persona, Harold, goes to an island. He's a hypochondriac. He's there with his nurse. He's supposed to be recovering. And what he finds on this island is a revolution a day. And so in this sleepy town of Paradiso. And the Mexican government was really outraged. There's a lot of correspondence about it. And Lloyd responded by saying, I'm going to definitively, and the word that he used was ocularly. So he was going to visually show that this did not take place in Mexico, even though it was rife with stereotypes, even though everything seemed to point to a kind of satire of the Mexican Revolution. And they did it by inserting a map into the film, on which they animated a boat traveling to the Pacific coast of South America somewhere, to an island kind of somewhere out in the middle of the ocean. And they were like, there, we fixed it. Like, it's not Mexico, clearly. It's this other imaginary place. And this was something that the US industry resorted to with some frequency.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. So they did have power. I mean, these markets were important enough for Hollywood that there was power in at least threatening the boycott or enacting it, even if it
A
wasn't
limited
totally
amount of
effective.
power. Yeah, I mean, I think, and mostly in this case, because Mexico is the gateway to the rest of Latin America. And at the time, you imagine like the European market's not really accessible in the same way that it would be later. They need to continue, and the US is making incredible profits on the films that it sends abroad.
As the Mexican film industry, its domestic film industry began to grow, how did that kind of connect with these imported films from the US? Did they compete? Did the US get a much smaller share of the market, or how did that evolve?
That is such an interesting story, actually. And I guess I would say that they had a relationship of interdependence. The story that we typically hear about the Mexican film industry is one of kind of a national and nationalist culture industry. And that certainly were the aims of film producers. But American films are still being shown. They generally have market share, even through the so-called golden age. Many Mexican, and this is actually the subject of my next book, many Mexican films were distributed by American firms, arms of US studios, et cetera, both in Latin America and then in the United States, where Mexican films found their biggest market, their biggest international market in the Southwestern United States. And so there's this kind of cooperation happening. Seth Fein called it collaboration, in which the Mexican film industry is actually really dependent on the US film industry in lots of ways. It's dependent in terms of distribution. It's dependent in terms of technology. It's dependent in terms of money sometimes. So RKO goes and finances Churubusco Studios, which we know of today as this kind of side of the national film industry, but it's born as a transnational business deal in which RKO thinks it's going to be able to make films more cheaply in Mexico using location shooting and cheaper labor. And Mexican film producers are excited because it's going to have the latest technology. It's going to have technicians from the United States. It represents a real step forward. So there is this interdependence. And at the same time, and this is something that Colin Gunkel has written really extensively about, and I owe a lot of my knowledge about it to him, is that the Mexican film industry is trying to figure out how to make films that appeal to a domestic audience and appeal to international audiences. And the first kind of wave of films that might resonate with the Western in some way are films about the revolution, films that are set in the North, in the desert, that feature soldiers on horseback, etc. And those films are considered by many kind of not an acceptable product. The revolution is kind of problematic in these representations. It's violent. It's not the image that the government wants to circulate about Mexico. Doesn't attract tourists. Like, you don't want tourists to come and be in the middle of a revolution. The comedia ranchera, which is the kind of genre of film, these kind of singing cowboy films, are the equivalent in the United States. Kind of just think Gene Autry, right?
I've heard of him.
Yeah, I'm sure you have. Are like the compromise by the Mexican film industry. It's really a compromise genre where they say, how can we make a film that's distinctively Mexican, that makes use of the landscape, which was one of the things that Mexican filmmakers were like, we have this beautiful landscape. It's not just the desert, but the mountains, et cetera. How can we use it, but also appeal to foreign audiences? So it becomes this kind of two-pronged approach. And it's also, I mean, and Colin makes this point really beautifully, intermedial, because Mexican music is incredibly popular in the 1930s in the United States. So there's this kind of cross-pollination, not only in terms of genres, and I wouldn't call the comedia ranchera a Western per se. It has a different politics. It has a different kind of aesthetic than most Westerns. They're musicals to begin with, which is not what people commonly think of when they think of American Westerns. But it represents a kind of mixing of kind of attractions or spectacles, right? So one of the things that people are really interested in are these charro figures on horseback wearing these fancy outfits, right? And the charreria, or the practice at like kind of rodeo, becomes a national sport in Mexico in the early 1930s. It's popularized in the 1920s, but I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that all of the symbols that we associate with Mexico and being Mexican are symbols that are part of regional cultures. Certainly, they existed. But in the 1920s, the Mexican government does like this wholesale PR effort to popularize those symbols, among them the charro, and to make them stand for Mexico and to make them stand for Mexican folkloric culture and tradition, et cetera. And so the comedia ranchera kind of takes these symbols, mixes them in with some popular music, and some stories that are like kind of love triangles, not the typical Western storyline, sets them in a hacienda in the past, and then offers them to Mexican audiences, ethnic Mexican audiences on both sides of the border, and to American audiences. To American audiences, they're like, oh, this is fascinating. In Ayana Rancho Grande, there's this one character my students always remark on his presence. He's an American and he's at a cockfight. And he's kind of this bumbling character, but I think there's a way to understand him as a figure for the American spectator, for whom all of this is like very fascinating, right? Cockfights, horse races, music, etc., like folkloric dancing, and they find it really fascinating.
That's so interesting because it is about the same time as sort of a lot of the Spanish fantasy stuff here in Southern California too, or a little, maybe some of that's a little earlier, but it sounds like people were probably somewhat primed to be interested, maybe like Anglo audiences be interested.
Oh, definitely. Oh, it really fit with some of the kind of representations of California's past that are in circulation at the time. And Mexico, the Mexican government was like, we want to encourage tourism. So we want to have films that appeal, where people are like, oh, I want to go see a cockfight. I want to go like, see what the countryside is like, even though, some scholars have argued that the politics of the comedia ranchera are really regressive. They're really represent this kind of nostalgia for a past in which there was no class conflict, in which women occupied a particular place, and in which the kind of social order of the countryside was intact, right? Which is not what happens after the revolution.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but this is like the 30s and 40s that these really took off, the comedia ranchera.
Yeah, in the mid 1930s, 1936 is when Ayana Rancho Grande is first exhibited. It's exhibited in the United States. It's extremely popular in the US. There's really interesting coverage of it in the US trade papers. So this is kind of mid 30s to 40s that these become kind of almost too popular. It's like they're like, we found a formula and we're going to kind of just keep making these really formulaic, and they're banking on the popularity of singers like Tito Huizar, people who are really popular on the radio, both in Mexico and in the United States. And they're banking on a certain nostalgia in terms of ethnic audience, immigrant audiences, kind of thinking about their homeland. Colin Gunkel and I are actually writing a book about the first Mexican film critic, ethnic Mexican film critic. He was an immigrant to the United States. But a lot of that, the kind of Mexican press, the mainstream Spanish language press in the United States, really was focused on this discourse of Mexico being representing tradition and the past and everything that was good, in the United States representing this kind of modernity and problematics. And so these films also fit right in with that, by representing a homeland that was attractive, that was kind of emotionally pulled at your heartstrings via music. So it kind of fit well with a lot of different kind of conversations that were happening at that time.
Sounds very parallel to what the West has symbolized too, in some senses, this pre-modern sort of, not necessarily quite as idyllic, but a similar like pre-modern past. And were those all sort of implicitly set in the north of Mexico too, the ranchera?
That's a really interesting question. I don't think they're necessarily explicitly set in the north, but they're implicitly set on haciendas. Yeah. So there's a connotation of the rural. They're not set on plantations, which, so in southern Mexico, you have haciendas where they're growing sugar. I guess you would think of them as like tropical crops, coffee, sugar, in Yucatan, sisal, for twine. And so they're more set in these kind of central or northern settings on these big kind of rural ranches. So in that way, there's a resonance, right? And northern Mexico for Mexicans functions as this kind of frontier in a way that's similar to, but different from the way that the frontier functions for the United States and its own, its mythology of itself, right? As the frontier, northern Mexico wasn't settled for a long time. It was considered really dangerous. It was the site of wars with indigenous peoples, with the Yaqui. And so it had this kind of rough and tumble reputation. But I think you see the North more explicitly in films about the revolution, because a lot of fighting takes place in the North. When, I was thinking about this conversation, and I was thinking, it's hard to map it on one-to-one, but it's almost like there are similar processes. I don't think there's the notion necessarily of manifest destiny, but there's the notion of settlement, of taming the North, of making it part of the nation. And then there's this notion of what is national identity. I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting in the comedia rancheras is that you don't really have a lot of indigenous characters. Like, it's generally mestizos and maybe peasants, but in this kind of more generic way, but indigenous communities. Whereas when I think about, all the hours I spent with my dad watching Westerns on KQED, in the, back in the day, reruns, is that the conflict between Anglo-Americans and Indigenous Americans is really at the forefront of the American Western. And I think that's less the case in the kind of Mexican films that we might think of as being Western adjacent.
Yeah. Western adjacent is a good way to put it.
You didn't ask me this, Josh, but I'm going to tell you anyway.
Please.
Okay. Well, because I just finished writing this essay and I was really excited about it, about extras, about ethnic Mexican extras, working in Hollywood, because this is, you had mentioned before, kind of how does immigration affect this dynamic? And one of the ways is, in just really practical terms, that the US film industry migrates. So there's kind of two migrations. The US film industry migrates to Southern California in the mid-teens, early to mid-teens. And then we have ethnic Mexicans migrating during the revolution and afterwards. They, like a lot of people, were like, working in Hollywood seems really cool. Let's do it. But often what they ended up doing were playing extras in Westerns, in those same films that are promoting stereotypes. So there's kind of tension between participating in the film industry and then being asked to perform roles. And they're not the only group that has this issue, right? Indigenous people do as well, where they are playing kind of the backgrounds or the villagers, the soldiers, etc. Often they're desirable for their ability to ride horses, and they can make extra money if they have skills in terms of horseback riding, other kinds of rodeo related skills. They're not paid very well. But they still want to do it. So it's very interesting. This persists like through the 1930s, where ethnic Mexican immigrants will talk about in the Spanish language press, performing in films that they think they're kind of ridiculous. They think they're not particularly accurate or particularly flattering. And yet they're really excited to be part of this kind of glamorous world of cinema. And of course, people hope that they'll be discovered, because there are stories of ethnic Mexicans being discovered. Gilbert Roland, for example, starts out as an extra and then he becomes this huge star.
Are there others?
Let's see who started as an extra. There are some women who are working in the 1930s. Armida Vendrell is one of them. So Dolores Del Rio doesn't start as an extra. Navarro does. Ramon Navarro, and I guess Gilbert Roland, I guess also Anthony Quinn, right? Begins as an extra and then is discovered and becomes a huge star. So people have this idea in their head, because Mexicans, even Mexican immigrants, are really at this moment kind of also immersed in American film culture, and thinking about like, what would it mean to be a star? how do I get there? You know, often they just got these like very precarious extra jobs in which they didn't make very much money, and they often reported having to do like the most dangerous or the most unexciting, or you know, and location shooting also made use of Mexicans when they needed to. So both in Mexico and in Arizona and Texas, kind of employing local people to be background in films. And I actually think that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
And kind of an untold story, because we kind of hear that like they just weren't part of Hollywood, except for these really few people. And I think it's that they weren't part of Hollywood in a way that's legible to us as we know film history. But you know, they really were important to these films that thematized Southern California, films that were about those kind of Spanish fantasy heritage and the Western. They were kind of integral to producing realism. And I put it in quotes because it's kind of a false realism of those films. One thing I did want to mention, so I don't really work on this period, but I think it's really interesting, is that in the 50s and the 60s, there is a genre called pony films in Mexico. And they're kind of low budget Westerns. They're not good. They're like, you know, set out in rural areas. They have bar fights, like a cantina fight. There's horses, etc. But they're not quality films. So they're not like the spaghetti Western. They're not this kind of elevated interpretation. But they were popular. So in terms of just audiences, right? So they're like vigilantes. So you see these little kind of eruptions of the American Western. You even see it in the silent period in Mexico. I mean, a lot of silent films that were made in Mexico are lost. But some that we do have, there's a film called El Tren Fantasma that was made in 1927 in Orizaba, Veracruz. And it features a masked vigilante gang. And there are definitely a train robbery, and there's some really interesting ways in which it kind of is responding to the popularity of American Westerns in a very kind of Mexican way. And I think the pony films do this as well, right? Where they're taking a kind of popular genre and riffing on it in ways that would make sense to their audience. I mean, and you can argue that films about the border, about the frontier, even kind of narco films, are also kind of in dialogue with the Western in certain ways, in terms of lawlessness, right? The corruption of violence, these kind of good versus evil narratives, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of ways in which like you could think really expansively about the influence of the American Western on Mexican cinema. Often it's not going to be found in the cinema that we think of as quality cinema. It's going to be found in these kind of more popular genres.
Yeah, I think we find that to some degree in American Westerns too, that they're not necessarily good movies in the sense of high cinema, but they're very popular and appeal to maybe especially working class audiences.
Yeah, so the pony films, I mean, I'm not sure I'm the right viewer for the pony films, but I'm fascinated that they exist.
Yeah.
And that they were called the pony films. Like I'm kind of curious, but I think again, this kind of circles back to the idea that Mexican film viewers were so voracious and cosmopolitan, right? That they could claim like lots of different traditions, and US films continue to circulate for decades, right? And even today, right? Like you go to Mexico, a lot of the films that are in theaters are American films. That kind of cross-pollinization. And I think in the comedia ranchera, what you see is like taking that cross-pollinization and making it do the cultural work that film was required to do in the 1930s and 1940s of presenting a certain image of Mexico.
And entertaining with music and
and attracting audiences, right? Like, but that is also the cultural work, right? Like we're going to celebrate these kind of cultural forms that we have that are popular and not particularly controversial. And some of them are drawn, like the ranchera, from very particular kind of regional contexts. And we're going to celebrate that and allow that to do the work of creating a cohesive national identity, and both for internal consumption and external consumption.
So great to hear about all of this and talk to you and learn about all this. So thank you so much for coming and talking. The Autry Museum of the American West thanks our members and supporters.